Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Good topic? Let's do it. Those of you who have been out to sea, what's the creepiest thing you've seen out there? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Prior Navy here. Saw a few intense things during that time, but this was afterwards doing a security job. Navy stuff is mostly just injuries and stuff like that. I'll start by saying I'm not a superstitious person, not religious, don't believe aliens are here on Earth or anything like that. I'm a game designer and engineering master's degree student. I believe in what can be proven through science, but maybe believe science hasn't explained everything yet. Empirically, it hasn't explained everything yet. But I have no worldly explanation for this story. The post was basically a fire watch. Stay up all night, do rounds to make sure the ship doesn't sink or catch fire. Ship was in port for a major overhaul. They had completely ripped out the wiring of the old all-hands PA system for modernization. The old one was your typical megaphone-looking loudspeakers mounted to bulkheads throughout the ship. The loudspeakers themselves were still attached to the walls, but the wiring was literally cut, and the system itself was completely gone. Around 3 a.m. one night I heard that all-hands whistle. Imagine your typical bosun's whistle, and then some mumbling like someone was trying to talk through the speakers. I was a little confused because I could clearly see the cut wires, and I knew I was alone on the ship. But I chalked it up to possibly interference in the magnetic speakers, picking up radio waves or something like that. On my next rounds, I discovered a shipyard worker had left a soldering iron on, and it had practically melted a hole in the deck. Not a fire, but a bright red spot on some smoking. I called it in, and it was handled by the shipyard damage control people. In the morning, when the crew arrived, I was discussing it with a member of the crew assigned to the officer of the day for the day. When he asked if anything else had happened overnight, I casually brought up the weird experience with the loudspeaker incident as a joke. He responded, completely deadpan, that it was the former XO of the ship, who apparently dropped dead at the intercom station. He said they'd experienced it a few times before, and it always preceded some kind of incident that could have gotten a crew member injured or endangered the ship. I wasn't sure if he was messing with me or if this was just typical sailor superstition that I've experienced before, so I was just polite about it and acted surprised and impressed. Fast forward a few shifts later, and I get the whistle and a weird crackling again, so out of pure paranoia, I decide to start my next rounds early. Sure enough, the seawater coolant system in the engine room is leaking into the compartment. Not a large leak, but if left unchecked, who knows what damage could have been done. About a year later, I ran into the same officer, and he told me the captain had requested the old loudspeakers be left up, even though they were disconnected. He said he'd left the crew shortly after those incidents, so he wasn't aware of any new cases. I've never heard anything like this happen before or since, but I still think about it all the time. I keep telling myself there's a logical explanation and it's just a weird coincidence, but I can't shake the eerie feeling from it all. Not necessarily at sea, but I worked on a research ship in the Arctic. We were slowly pushing our way through an ice fog. A friend and I were on deck having a smoke, just watching the ice slowly float by, when a large seal laying on the ice came into view. It was obviously dead, as the skin had fallen away from its ribs, but otherwise it was perfectly preserved. Just as the seal started to disappear into the fog, a polar bear appeared, crouched as though it was stalking the seal. It was also dead. The fur on its extended front leg had fallen away, exposing the bone. Otherwise, it was also perfectly preserved. Almost in unison, my friend and I looked at each other and said, "What the f—?" The only time I was ever on a ship was actually a cargo ship, and it was for a program for my business class. Basically, you got to shadow several people and see a product full journey. Like I started at a farm, went to a trucking depot, then a dry goods warehouse, then a cargo yard, then finally a cargo ship to China. Can't get off the ship when it gets there, so that was the end. Then catch a ride back on another cargo ship. Trip was very informative. The creepy thing, though, was it's 6 a.m. and the ship bleeds its horn. We're out somewhere in the Pacific and then slows down over the next 20 minutes. I made my way up to the guy that was doing the program, and he's talking to the captain, and the captain is clearly pretty freaked out. This is the absolute middle of nowhere, and there's a tiny coral island with no trees or vegetation, just a load of birds, and a cargo container next to a tent. The ship is hardly moving at this point, and the captain calls out over a megaphone to see if anyone is there. After a minute, a guy who's clean-shaven but wearing clothes worn to rags, island of deep, deep tan, wobbles out of the cargo container. Captain yells out if the guy needs help. He says something, but they can't hear it. The guy volunteered to go out to him on an inflatable boat. He climbs down the rope, gets on the boat. Meanwhile, the guy's just sitting on a bucket. He goes all the way over within 20 feet of the guy. They talk for a few minutes, and he comes back, climbs the ladder, and goes to the captain. Captain asks what the guy said. Guy goes, he said he's good. Guy gave no info, no plans. Had no food but dried fish and some water distilling thing. Is out hundreds of miles from another living person. Has no boat, and says, I'm good. Well, assuming that story is totally legit, maybe that guy has it all figured out. Maybe he doesn't need society or people, and if he can get fresh water and access to food, and he likes solitude, and where else would you want to be? Just gotta watch out for sea storms, but good luck. Pretty cool. I spent a summer on a fish processing vessel about 2/3 of the way out of the Aleutian Islands chain in Alaska, most of the way to Russia. We were buying fish from a large tender, and some of the older hands on my processor boat were grumbling. I asked why, and they told me a story. Turns out the year before, there had been a fire on the boat I was serving on, and this fire occurred while they were tied up to the same tender we were buying fish from right now. When the guys on the tender saw smoke coming up from our boat, they took axes and cut the lines instead of getting our guys onto their boat. A fire at sea is one of the worst things imaginable. Those pricks cut our boat loose without rescuing any of the crew. A year later, my bosses were still doing business with them. If I was in charge, I would have told them to go screw. Nobody on my processor boat was hurt, but it could have gone the other way very easily, and the guys on the tender would have just watched it happen. Oh, probably would have called in the Coast Guard, but otherwise, best of luck. It speaks to the intense greed of the commercial fishing industry. You'll expect otherwise, but I've seen more people drown than I would consider reasonable. It's always the same cycle. People get overconfident and don't bother wearing PPE. Then one day someone slips and falls to the water. Survival depends on the weather. Port reacts like a beehive. Suddenly everyone is hyper aware of PPE. But 1 month later, everyone's forgotten, and no one wants to bother with the tedious process of properly fitting a life jacket until someone falls again later, and we repeat the loop. Not a worker, but when I was younger, my family took a trip to the Florida Gulf. A couple cousins and I went deep-sea fishing about 20 to 30 miles off the coast. I got horrendously seasick and was bench-ridden the whole time and was taking a nap. When I finally woke up, a storm had started to roll in. I remember looking out the back of the boat and seeing the sky turning an ominous dark gray and the water just turned black. The waves were starting to get pretty intense, and the captain was all right, we really need to get back before this gets to the point where we can't. I never liked open water, and that experience just made it all the worse. Was traveling through Bab el-Mandeb. The sun had set about an hour before when all of a sudden we picked up 4 speedboats pacing us on radar with no running lights, and there was no moon, so it was dark. We top out at 20 knots. They sped us at around 35 to 45 and came within 6 nautical miles before leaving us be. The atmosphere on board completely changed. The old man got called to the bridge, and we were getting ready to call it in when they turned away and let us be. I was aboard the Maersk Carolina, which is a sister ship to the Maersk Alabama, and on the same route which got taken a year or two later. We had no armed security on board. Rogue waves freaked me out quite a bit. Never got to see them, worked in engineering, but I remember we got slapped by one beam at like 3 a.m., and it almost threw me out of my rack. Knocked a bunch of shit off that wasn't strapped down, almost broke our TV, and then it was right back to being pretty calm out. Everyone in my room woke up. Nobody got hurt, but we all just stared at each other like, what the f*** did that happen? I was on a large ferry in the middle of a cyclone. Waves were washing over the top of the third deck. All crew and passengers were in life jackets just in case. Not that it would have done much good at that point if we had abandoned ship. Waves ended up breaking some windows, and lower decks got a pretty good soaking, but other than a few scrapes and bruises and brown stains, we made it to port. Out tuna fishing about 170 miles off the Oregon coast one night, had shut down and was just about to go to bed, noticed an odd glowing orb the size of a football down in the water. Thought it was a bioluminescent jellyfish until it started moving. No swimming motion, just slowly cruising around the boat. Had a 1,000,000 candle power spotlight on board, so brought it out to see what it might be. But when I put the light on, it fully disappeared. Turned the light off, and there it was, plain as day. A few more showed up and moved around the boat for about 20 minutes. Never saw a trace of what they were in the light, but my crewmen and I were seeing the same thing. They eventually left, and we went to bed. My crewman was an old, salty dog, sailed from Vancouver Island to the South Pacific and back, single-handed twice. Worked on many tuna boats all over the Pacific. Said he'd never seen anything like it. This wasn't even out at sea. It was on a small coastal town about 30 miles north of Boston. There's a point off the main beach of this town that features a curved line of rocks extending into the ocean. It's a sort of a quarter-moon crescent-shaped formation that doesn't extend into the water more than 25, maybe 30 feet at most. However, there's an underwater cliff, and the depth of the water at the furthest point out is deep enough that you can't get to the bottom without specialized scuba gear, as in regular scuba diving equipment isn't enough. Something to keep in mind. If it isn't low tide, you can't get to this point without getting your feet or legs wet, about up to your knees. So, a handful of us are out there on the furthest point, and it's a popular spot for locals to saltwater fish. I just was watching the fishermen and doing nothing but enjoying the experience when I hear a fisherman give a soft but defeated "oh." It's difficult to describe, but "oh" isn't typically associated with a terrified reaction, but you could hear the absolute overwhelming duress in his voice. Like it was quiet because he couldn't catch his breath well enough to say more or say it louder. I turned to look, and there was this sea creature that was bigger than a bus, with fierce Jurassic Park-esque spots that were so close together they looked like stripes on first look. This thing was about 3 feet from the rock and riding right on top of the water. The most terrifying part was its mouth. It was big enough to swallow a sedan whole, and its teeth, they didn't even seem like real teeth. They were like a sci-fi horror uniteeth, in which the top and bottom were connected along the sides of its gargantuan mouth. I fully understand the first fisherman to spot it being unable to give more than an almost delicate "oh," as this didn't look like anything I'd ever heard of before. This was monsters from outer space, but this wasn't a movie. It was right there in the water in front of me. I half expected someone to pop out of the back of the thing and scream, "April Fools," as it didn't seem possible such a creature really existed. Turns out, It was a baskin shark, giant and fierce-looking, but it's a plankton-eating gentle giant. I'd heard the name before, but never so much as seen a picture of a baskin, and I guess neither did most other people there. For a few moments, we all stood there terrified, wondering what in the name of Alien versus Predator was going to happen to us. Finally, one of the older fishermen on the rock informed us what it was, and assured us we were in no danger. I believed him, but was still trembling for the rest of the night. Heavy seas during a storm on the flight deck, when you see real waves and feel how insignificant you are in the ocean, makes for a surreal experience. One wrong step, and there is literally no rescue. Now imagine you need to be along the side of the ship, pulling up heavy metal fences while the ship is bouncing around like a springboard up and down, side to side, all at the same time. Oil-slicked tarmac glides like butter, so you better pray you got the right boots on. Not gonna lie, I had to tap out momentarily and readjust my nutsack before I went out again. It was definitely an experience, man. It's creepy because after one liftoff, you wait around for the next sortie, and you can feel the ship getting thrown around, crashing reverberations through the flight hangar and residual oil from prior pre-flight maintenance that you are almost always going to walk into. Out of sight of land when the water suddenly went glass smooth as the sun was setting, and a crew member got floor psychosis and was fighting to step off the back swim deck onto the floor, i.e. the surface of the ocean he was convinced was actually land. He had to be handcuffed to a bunk and force-fed Valium, and we turned back to drop him off to the nearest port while he screamed about how the boat wasn't real. If he had bolted even a few seconds earlier, he would have likely died. I was working in a pearl boat for around 18 months on the Arafura Sea a few years ago, and one of my roles was keeping watch in the wheelhouse. Essentially, you make sure the boat is following the preset path on the navigation, and if it strays, you turn it manually to keep it within the course set. My watch was 4 to 8 a.m. About 7 a.m. I noticed a white cube, perhaps 200 meters port side, hard to say with no point of reference, but it didn't show up on the nav radar system we had that let you plot or recognize boats. It was also not bobbing up and down with the waves. It was just sat there on the waterline in the distance. I got a better look at it with the binoculars, and it was so strange seeing this white cube just sat still there on the sea in that distance. It wasn't really hovering above it, but as the waves moved with the ocean, every now and again, I could see the bottom of it, which is how I know it was a cube. Again, it's hard to say without a point of reference at sea, but I'm guessing it was the size of a van. I'm purely going off of how big things appear in the binoculars. When looking at things, I do know how big they are. The person who was following my shift came to drop me a coffee and saw it too, so I know it wasn't just me being tired. Following this a few years later, I saw when the Tic Tac videos came out from the Pentagon, and some fighter pilots said they saw 5 shaped objects floating in the sky. My father was in the Navy in the late 70s. His carrier was traveling through the Bermuda Triangle, heading for the Mediterranean. He was on the flight deck one night when all the power on the ship suddenly died. Even people's watches stopped working. Apparently, about this time, he and other sailors noticed 2 lights in the distance unmoving at about 100 feet above the water. The lights were visible for several minutes before they disappeared. My father didn't see them disappear, but others swore they saw the lights quickly descend into the water. In any case, after the lights disappeared, the power returned to the ship. My father doesn't believe in UFOs, stories about the Bermuda Triangle, or anything else supernatural. Well, he does wish that Bigfoot was real, lol. But to this day, he has no explanation for what happened. All he knows is that in those few minutes he experienced a strange sense of accepted dread that he's never felt before or since. There was a time when I thought he was just bullshitting us kids, even though he isn't that kind of guy. But when I was a teen, he had a mini reunion with some of his old Navy buddies, and they talked about it, even getting into a debate about whether it was aliens or some sort of secret military tech being tested. Stepdad built and chartered 40-foot boats to go fishing in the shallow ocean and deep-sea fishing. Past the continental drop-off, where you fish mahi-mahi and king mackerel and stuff. Group books a trip. Group is remembering a deceased friend who wants his ashes spread in the deep sea. They leave the docks. Once land disappeared, a small black cloud formed above their boat. It got bigger and bigger and darker and louder, but it only stayed above their boat. Blue skies around, but above their boat was a very dark and pissed-off cloud. The cloud follows them, thundering, making equipment go haywire, 20 years ago for what it's worth. My stepdad said, "We're here. Throw this angry mother over." They spread his ashes. He said the minute they spread his ashes, the thundering stopped, and within 5 minutes, the sky was perfectly clear. He is not one to believe in spooky stuff, but he said I had no explanation other than that son of a bitch was pissed off about being dead. I worked on a dive boat that took customers out for the weekend. Someone has to pick up the lights after the night dive. I've been alone at the seafloor 100 miles offshore in 100 feet of water with just some flashlights and a 19 cubic foot spare tank. It's creepy to hear the stuff that isn't in your light cone. Also, dozens of barracuda in a school when I dove off the sun deck. Dove as in diving board type dive, not scuba. Went about 20 feet below surface, surrounded by them. We would also occasionally spearfish for lionfish under the rigs and make ceviche. I had my trap full and 2 on the spear, with a nurse shark chasing me back to the boat. I missed that job. When I was in the Navy, we were just off the coast of Italy at midnight. It was dark night, and you couldn't see any lights from the shore at all. No stars. At some point we passed a long boat, basically an extended rowboat. It had no superstructure or anything. It had a light on. Ship's captain told us that there was a guy fishing, and the light would attract fish or whatever. So yes, whoever it was in completely exposed boat about 10 to 12 miles offshore in a completely dark night, and they had a light on to attract things. 400-meter container ship doing night rounds in the engine room gets awfully eerie. Ships creak and make a lot of weird noises, and when you're alone down there in a big cathedral of machinery, you start seeing and imagining weird things. So one day I'm just finishing up, and I'm about to open a door when the wheel suddenly flies around and it bursts open, revealing a ghostly apparition in the passageway which lunges toward me. Anyway, the next day I'm in front of the captain explaining why I punched the third engineer because he had been sleeping in the duty cabin and wandered down to raid the control room fridge wrapped in the bed duvet. Spooky stuff. When I flew for the Coast Guard a couple of years ago in the Caribbean, we detected a small open boat on the radar. It measured no more than 3 meters in length. We flew toward it and eventually picked it up with our optics. Zooming in, we saw 2 or more very decomposed bodies in the boat. We looked up the faded registration after our return to base and discovered the boat was a local fishing boat registered in Western Africa that had been missing for a few months. It was smack in the middle of the Caribbean Sea. Eventually, a cutter was tasked to collect the boat and tow it back, but it was decided to scuttle it. U.S. Navy cruiser, while inspecting a compartment called the Pittsword, as part of the sounding and security. It's a compartment all the way at the bottom of the ship that has no water in it to measure ship speed, only accessible through climbing a ladder well straight down 5 stories. Anyways, I had a shipmate swear he had his leg grabbed by something as he was climbing out, and it scared the hell out of him. I figured it was just an old sailor's tale and he was trying to scare us newbies. Nope, that compartment was haunted as fuck. I was in the Pittsburgh one night and bent over to look at the water level, and something grabbed my ass so hard I almost fell into the water. I was convinced it was a shipmate hiding down there, trying to play the ultimate prank. But after frantically looking under every nook and cranny in that compartment for about 10 minutes, I found nobody. So I'm standing there, realizing a horny sailor's ghost just copped a feel in the afterlife. I hated going down there after that. I was in the Navy 80 to 86, on patrol in the Persian Gulf, and one afternoon the captain got on the 1MC and announced that anyone available should go to the weather deck and take a look. It appears that a transport ship carrying a shipment of lambs experienced some sort of distress, and the herd had to dispose of its load at sea. There must have been 1,000 floating sheep in the ocean. I'll never forget that day. Random snippets of chatter on the radio. I was a radio operator on the 31st MEU. We shouldn't have heard anyone else but the other ships. I figured the band some Japanese ships were using was close enough to ours that occasionally we'd hear a word or two. It only happened when we were near Japan, and it never bothered anyone else. That's pretty much the creepiest thing I could think of, unless you find looking at the ocean at night with minimal light creepy. Personally, I thought it was pretty. About 15 years ago, there was a long heat wave across the whole of Europe, and I was visiting family in southern Ireland. Since it was so hot, I went swimming on the coast. Weirdly, as I entered and my ears got close to the water's surface, I could hear a constant, loud whining, like 100 mosquitoes right beside my ear, but coming from all around. I guess the local conditions meant wave sounds were reflected and interfering or something, but I found it really unnerving and was already thinking about getting out. I kept on swimming, though, and had got quite far out when suddenly I saw in the water, directly in front of me, a huge bloodshot eye looking up at me. It was at least a meter wide, and totally made me jump in the water. It was a massive jellyfish, with tentacles maybe 4 meters long or more. I turned around to go back to the shore, but saw that there were a dozen more enormous jellyfish all around and below me, all with the red bloodshot eye pattern. I had to carefully weave around them to get back. It turned out that the heat wave had forced jellyfish from Spain to migrate north. So, not really creepy, and I doubt they were dangerous, but as far as low-level shocks go, it really gave me the chills as it happened.